They say the young think they know everything. But one careless word can reveal how little they truly understand. My grandson called me poor once, said I lived in the past, clinging to memories and dust. He didn't know that the past can hold more than dust. It can hold secrets, promises, and fortunes that wait for the right moment. He laughed at my worn-out coat, my old wooden furniture. He forgot that everything old was once new, and everything forgotten can return with power. I didn't raise him to chase money. But when he mocked me, something inside me shifted. I decided to show him what real wealth looks like. And it wasn't in the numbers. It was in the truth. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the Old Folks channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far our stories travel. The dining room felt warm, but the words that fell from my grandson's mouth were cold enough to freeze the air. We were all gathered around the old oak table, the same one my late husband had built decades ago. Candlelight flickered over the silverware, but his tone cut sharper than any knife. "Grandma," he said, smirking, "you really should have invested better. You're still living like it's the 1950s. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, just careless. The kind that stings because they don't even realize they've hurt you. I smiled faintly, tracing the rim of my teacup, watching the steam curl and vanish. Some things age well, I said softly, others don't. He didn't hear the edge beneath my calm. He never does. And that was the first mistake he made that night. The rain began soon after dinner, soft at first, then louder, tapping against the old windows like quiet knocks from the past. The family left one by one, voices fading into the storm, leaving behind only half-empty cups and the faint smell of cinnamon tea. I sat alone for a while, staring at the empty chair my husband used to sit in. The words replayed in my head, "You're poor, Grandma." Poor. The word didn't bother me, not the way he thought it would. It was the arrogance behind it, the blindness. My hand trembled slightly as I opened the old drawer by my chair. Inside lay an envelope, yellowed with age, its corners frayed. It was marked with a single line in my husband's handwriting, "For when they forget who you are." The room dimmed as the last candle flickered out. Only the sound of rain and the ticking clock filled the silence. I held the envelope under the lamp, tracing the faded ink like it was a map to something long buried. Inside, a single key glinted, small, simple, but heavy with memory. A key to a place my grandson didn't know existed. As thunder rolled across the sky, I closed my eyes and whispered, "Maybe it's time." The clock struck 10, its chime echoing through the house like an answer. And for the first time in years, I felt the stir of something old, something waiting to be remembered. I remember the day he gave me that key, my husband, Thomas. It was a Sunday morning, sunlight spilling through lace curtains, dust dancing in the light. We were young, still building our lives from scratch, still believing the world would be kind if we were. He had taken my hand and said, "Someday, people might forget what we built. But this key, it remembers." He placed it in my palm, along with a slip of paper, the name of a small, quiet bank at the edge of town. We promised never to touch the account unless there was no other choice. And when he passed away, I kept that promise, even when times grew hard. The memory blurred as tears welled in my eyes. The key still felt warm in my hand, as if Thomas himself had just placed it there. I walked to the window, watching the rain slide down the glass like time itself slipping away. The streets outside glistened under the dim yellow glow of street lamps, and in the reflection, I saw a younger version of myself, hopeful, stubborn, and strong. The world had changed since then. My grandson's generation measured worth in zeros and cars, not in silence and sacrifice. But that account, that promise, had grown, quietly, untouched, like a secret garden behind locked gates. I could almost hear Thomas whispering, "Let them think what they will. The truth doesn't need to shout." And maybe it was time for the truth to finally speak. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the photograph on my mantel, the one of Thomas in his uniform, smiling. I touched the frame, feeling the cool glass beneath my fingertips. "You always did know best," I murmured. The air in the room seemed to shift, heavier, charged, almost watchful. I opened my purse and slipped the key inside, beside my old leather wallet. Tomorrow, I would visit that bank. I hadn't stepped through those doors in nearly half a century. And I couldn't shake the feeling that what waited there was more than just money. The next morning, the house was silent, too silent for comfort. I could hear only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the old wall clock. My grandson, Ethan, walked past me, his phone in hand, not even glancing my way. "Morning," I said, voice calm, steady. He nodded, barely. "Morning, Grandma. Oh, by the way, we're having guests tonight, so maybe don't wear those old clothes, okay?" His tone was polite, but sharp enough to draw blood. I smiled faintly. "Don't worry," I said. "I'll wear something fitting." He didn't notice the way I lingered on that last word. I watched him leave for work, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, bouncing off old memories. The same house his grandfather had built, brick by brick, now felt colder with each passing day. He used to visit me with flowers when he was a boy, asking me to bake his favorite pie. Now he barely spoke, treating me like an old photograph, something to keep out of guilt, not love. I stood at the window, watching his car disappear down the street, and whispered, "You forgot who made this life possible." The rain had stopped, but the clouds lingered, thick, gray, unmoving. It felt like the sky was holding its breath, waiting. That evening, laughter filled the house again, but it wasn't mine. Ethan's friends came over, young, loud, all dressed in luxury. They looked at the furniture, the wallpaper, the old piano, and I could feel their judgment in every glance. One of them whispered, "This place feels like a museum." I smiled politely, offering them tea. "Careful," I said softly, "some of these antiques are worth more than your cars." They laughed, until I didn't. For a brief second, the room went quiet. And in that silence, I decided, tomorrow, they'd all learn what wealth really looked like. The next morning, I dressed differently, an elegant beige coat, pearl earrings, the same ones I wore when Thomas proposed. I took a cab to the old district, where streets were narrow and lined with history instead of glass towers. The rain from the night before had left puddles that reflected the gray sky, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and old paper. The sign above the door read Harper & Company. Private bank, established 1942. The moment I stepped inside, the scent of polished wood and time greeted me. An old memory flickered, me and Thomas, standing here hand in hand, laughing. Now, I stood alone. But not powerless. The teller looked surprised when I handed her the envelope. "I'm here to access a long-standing account," I said, my voice firm. She took the paper, scanned the handwriting, and her eyes widened slightly. "One moment, ma'am." She disappeared into the back. Minutes passed. Then the manager himself appeared, an older man, respectful, cautious. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said softly, "we've been expecting this someday." His words sent a chill down my spine. Expecting me? What exactly had Thomas arranged? He led me into a private room, where an old metal box sat on the table, polished but ancient. He placed the key I brought into the lock. It turned easily, like it had been waiting for my touch all these years. Inside, bundles of documents, certificates, and bonds lay perfectly preserved. At the very bottom, a single slip of paper, a statement, with numbers that made my breath catch. It wasn't just money. It was legacy. Power. I closed the box slowly, a faint smile touching my lips. For the first time in years, I didn't feel old, I felt alive. That evening, Ethan came home late again, reeking of arrogance and cheap cologne. He tossed his jacket on the couch and said, "Grandma, can you transfer me some cash? I'm short this month." I stared at him quietly. "How much do you need?" He shrugged. "Just a few thousand." "You probably don't have it, but I figured I'd ask." The words were casual, but the insult wasn't. I smiled faintly. "Oh, I think I can manage that," I said, pouring myself tea. He didn't notice the way I said it, slow, deliberate, as though the walls themselves had started to listen. He followed me into the study, impatience in every step. The room smelled of old books and faint lavender, a scent that once meant home. I reached for a folder from the drawer, but instead of pulling out a checkbook, I slid an old photograph across the table. It was of his grandfather, standing proudly in front of the same house, holding the very first bank document. Ethan frowned. "What's this supposed to mean?" "Everything," I said quietly. "Sit down." And for the first time in a long while, he did. I told him a story, not about money, but about survival. How Thomas worked 3 jobs just to save enough for this home. How every sacrifice built the fortune he now took for granted. But Ethan wasn't listening. He was scrolling through his phone, bored. Finally, he said, "Grandma, that's sweet, but times have changed. You can't take old money seriously anymore." I looked him in the eye. "Oh, darling," I whispered. "You'll take this money very seriously soon." And he laughed. That laugh would echo in his head for years. 2 days later, I invited Ethan to join me at the bank. He groaned but agreed when I mentioned his inheritance. As we entered the quiet marble lobby, he looked around, unimpressed. "This place looks ancient." "Yes," I said, "and it's outlasted everyone who mocked it." The same manager greeted me warmly, leading us into the private room once again. Ethan looked confused, until the metal box was placed on the table. "What's that?" he asked, his smirk fading slightly. "Your grandfather's idea of a safety net," I said softly. "Open it." His fingers trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, the documents gleamed under the golden light. Stocks, bonds, and property deeds, all still active, all in my name. Ethan's jaw dropped. "This can't be real." I chuckled. "Oh, it's very real. You see, while you were buying sneakers, I was earning interest." He looked at me differently then, almost afraid. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. I leaned closer. "Because you needed to learn what poor really means." His face went pale. He didn't have an answer. The manager cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, would you like to make a withdrawal?" I smiled, eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Yes," I said. "But not for money. For clarity." Ethan blinked, confused. I signed one form, then turned to him. "You see, wealth isn't about what you have. It's about what you protect." And in that moment, I saw the flicker of understanding, small, fragile, but real. He looked down at the floor, ashamed. But lessons like these, they don't end in one day. That night, the rain came again, slow, steady, almost mournful. I sat by the window, watching droplets trace past down the glass, the city lights blurring behind them. Ethan hadn't spoken since the bank visit. He ate in silence, eyes darting away whenever I looked at him. I could tell pride was crumbling inside him, piece by piece. But guilt takes its time to bloom. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. "Did you think I was poor, Ethan?" He looked up, startled, his lips parting, but no words came out. The rain answered for him. Later, I found him standing in the study, holding that same photograph of his grandfather. His reflection flickered in the window, a boy pretending to be a man. "Grandpa looks proud," he said quietly. "He was," I replied, "of what he built. And who he hoped he'd become." He looked down. "I messed that up, didn't I?" I walked closer, placing my hand on his shoulder. "Mistakes aren't what break us, Ethan. It's refusing to learn from them that does." The silence between us felt heavier than the storm outside. And yet, somewhere in it, something fragile began to mend. When he went to bed, I stayed awake, staring at the flickering fireplace. Its glow painted the walls in shades of golden shadow, like memories dancing before fading away. I thought of Thomas again, of the promise we made, that love should never spoil into entitlement. And I knew what I had to do next. The inheritance papers were still in my drawer, and signed. By morning, they wouldn't be blank anymore. Because sometimes, a lesson has to leave a mark that money can't erase. Morning sunlight crept into my room, soft and pale, illuminating the dust motes suspended in air. The world outside was calm, deceptive calm, the kind that comes before change. I sat at my writing desk, pen trembling slightly between my fingers. The document before me was simple, a will. The names written there carried weight, mine, Thomas's, and Ethan's. I hesitated, whispering, "You'll thank me one day." Then, with one careful stroke, I signed. But not how he'd expect. The paper glided into an envelope, sealed with red wax, just like Thomas used to do. I pressed our family crest ring into the soft wax, feeling its warmth cool beneath my hand. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was truth, discipline, and legacy. Downstairs, I heard Ethan laughing on the phone, carefree again, unaware of what I was finalizing upstairs. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But I remembered the day he called me poor. How easily those words came from lips I once kissed goodnight. And I knew pity had no place in justice. I placed the envelope inside my jewelry box, beneath old letters and fading photographs. The house was quiet except for the sound of the grandfather clock, ticking like a heartbeat. Every tick felt like a countdown, not to revenge, but revelation. Outside, the sky shifted to gold. Birds sang softly, oblivious to the storm I had just sealed with wax. I whispered, "Thomas, I'd done what you would have wanted." A cool breeze slipped through the half-open window, brushing my cheek. It almost felt like he was answering me. Days passed before I told Ethan I wanted to speak with him. He came into the living room, distracted, tapping on his phone. "This'll be quick, right?" he muttered. "Yes," I said, "very." I held the sealed envelope in my hands, calm, deliberate, and placed it on the table between us. "What's that?" he asked. "It's the answer to your question," I said. "How poor am I?" He frowned, unsure whether to laugh or be afraid. I didn't break his arrogance with shouting. I let silence do it for me. He tore open the envelope, scanning the first few lines, his eyes widening. "What is this?" he whispered. "It's my will," I said softly. "Everything I own, every cent, every memory, written clearly." He looked up, panic flickering in his gaze. "You left it to charity?" I nodded slowly. "To those who remember gratitude when they have nothing. You had everything, and forgot." The air between us turned heavy. He stood frozen, unable to speak. He sank onto the couch, the paper shaking in his hands. "I didn't mean what I said, Grandma," he muttered. "I was stupid." I nodded. "Yes. You were." Tears slipped down his face, the first I'd seen in years. I wanted to comfort him, but some truths needed space to hurt before they could heal. So I whispered, "This house was never about wealth. It was about worth." He looked at me then, really looked, and saw me for the first time in years. The storm had finally passed, but the wreckage remained. Weeks later, I prepared to leave the house for good. Ethan helped me pack, quiet and solemn. He didn't ask where I was going, only carried each box with careful hands. There was no more arrogance, no more distance, just quiet regret. As I walked through the halls one last time, my fingers brushed the old photographs, each one whispering a memory. Thomas and I on our wedding day. Ethan as a child, smiling, proud. I smiled faintly. Maybe this is what forgiveness feels like, I thought. Not forgetting. Just letting go. At the front door, I handed him a small velvet pouch. He opened it and found a single key, the key to the safe deposit box at Harper & Company. "There's still something left for you," I said softly. "But it's not money." He looked puzzled. "Then what is it?" "Read the letter inside," I replied, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. He stood there, silent, clutching the key, the wind tugging at his sleeves. For once, he didn't chase after answers. He simply listened to the quiet. That night, I boarded a train to the countryside, my reflection flickering against the darkened window. In my heart, I felt peace, like the weight of generations had finally lifted. The whistle blew, the wheels turned, and the city lights faded behind me. I imagined Ethan opening the letter, reading the words I'd written. Wealth fades. Character doesn't. The richest hearts are the ones that learn after losing. He would understand. And someday, when he truly did, that key would open more than a box. It would open his heart. They say money reveals character. But I learned something different. It doesn't change who you are, it simply shows what's already there. My grandson thought wealth meant control, power, pride. But the richest people I've known were those who never needed to prove it. That day, he saw more than numbers on a page. He saw humility and what it costs to lose it. And maybe one day, when he's older, he'll understand that I didn't show him my fortune to shame him. I showed him to remind him, respect is the only currency that never loses its value. And in that quiet truth, I found my peace.